The cry that breaks the quiet desert evening is not human. It's the scared howl of a wolf in deadly trouble. Gray Hawk, a 52-year-old Apache man, hears his friend Tiva's painful cry and knows something bad is happening. He finds the huge snake wrapped tight around Tiva's body. The snake is thick as a tree trunk. Tiva is trapped in its deadly coils, her eyes wide with fear, her breathing short and fast as the snake squeezes harder and harder. Gray Hawk doesn't think twice. He jumps into the fight and grabs the snake with his bare hands. He feels its strong body twist under his grip. The battle is rough and scary, man against beast, love against death. When it's over, both Gray Hawk and Tiva are hurt and bleeding. But what happens when the neighbors hear about this fight will change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Gray Hawk built his cabin in the New Mexico high desert 15 years ago, back when he thought it might hold a family. Those dreams died 5 winters past, when illness took his wife Maria Elena and daughter Sophie within weeks of each other. All his knowledge from his days as an Apache scout during the border wars couldn't save them from the fever that swept the reservation. 3 days after burying his family, Gray Hawk found a tiny wolf pup crying near the old mining road. The little creature was barely alive, abandoned and weak from hunger. He named her Tiva, to dance in his grandfather's language, because even as a pup she moved with joyful energy that reminded him beauty still existed. Gray Hawk bottle-fed Tiva for weeks, sleeping beside her basket. He taught her to hunt by hiding meat around the property, building trust while respecting her wild nature. Now 6 years old, Tiva stood 3 feet tall with thick gray fur and amber eyes that seemed almost human. She was his companion and reminder that love could exist without words. Their routine never changed, morning coffee on the porch, then walking the land together. But evenings held the deepest meaning. As the sun set behind the western mountains, they would climb to the mesa's highest point, where ancient petroglyphs told stories carved in rock thousands of years old. From there, they could see for miles. The reservation to the north where Gray Hawk was born, Santa Fe's distant lights. To the east, endless desert dotted with ranches to the south, and the sacred mountains rising like guardians to the west. During these quiet hours, Gray Hawk would speak to Tiva about memories of Maria Elena's laugh, Sophie's chatter, and the loneliness that settled on his shoulders like an old coat. Tiva would listen with the patience of someone who understood that some stories needed telling. The neighbors knew him mainly by reputation, the quiet Apache man who kept to himself, who'd served in the military, who lived with a wolf and preferred solitude. Maria Santos on her ranch 3 miles south sometimes saw them during evening walks. Tom Richardson noticed his cattle seemed calmer near Gray Hawk's boundary. Sarah Chen, the school teacher in town, heard her students mention the Indian man with the wolf during camping trips. None of them imagined that within days their quiet neighbor's world would intersect with theirs and change everyone involved. That Tuesday evening in late September, Gray Hawk felt the familiar contentment as he and Tiva walked toward their usual sunset spot. The air carried autumn's first coolness. He checked the simple leather collar he'd made for Tiva, ensuring the silver tag was secure, a practical thing he'd never expected to need. Gray Hawk couldn't know this evening would shatter his peace forever, or that the breaking would lead him back toward the human connections he'd been avoiding. Sometimes the most important changes begin with a sound, a cry in the darkness that changes everything. The desert evening wind carried Tiva's cry across the mesa like a message from the spirit world. Sharp, desperate, filled with terror, Gray Hawk had never heard in her voice before. He dropped the piece of juniper bark he'd been examining and ran toward the sound, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found them in a small clearing between 2 massive boulders, locked in a struggle that seemed to belong in nightmares rather than the peaceful desert he knew so well. The snake was enormous, its body thick as Gray Hawk's waist and colored in patterns of brown and yellow that had let it blend perfectly with the sandy ground until it struck. Tiva was wrapped in its coils from chest to hindquarters, her amber, eyes wide with panic as the serpent tightened its grip with each of her struggles. Gray Hawk's training kicked in before conscious thought could paralyze him. In the border wars, hesitation meant death. He'd learned to act first and think later when lives were at stake. His hand moved instinctively to the hunting knife on his belt, the same blade that had saved his life more times than he could count. During his military service, "Easy, girl," he said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "I'm here." The snake's head turned toward him, tongue flicking to taste his scent. Its eyes were cold, ancient, holding no malice, but no mercy either. This was simply nature following its course, predator and prey locked in a dance as old as the desert itself. But Gray Hawk refused to accept that Tiva would be prey today. He circled slowly, looking for an opening. The snake had positioned itself, well, using the rocks to anchor its body while its coils did their deadly work. Tiva's breathing was becoming labored, her struggles weaker. Gray Hawk knew he had minutes at most before the constriction would crush her ribs or stop her heart. The knife felt familiar in his hand, weighted and balanced the way good tools should be. Gray Hawk had made it himself years ago, forging the blade from high-carbon steel and wrapping the handle in leather. He'd tooled with traditional Apache patterns. It was more than a weapon. It was a connection to his heritage, to the generations of his people who had survived in this harsh land. Through skill and courage, moving with the silent grace his grandfather had taught him, Gray Hawk positioned himself behind the snake's head. The creature was focused on Tiva, confident in its ability to complete the kill. That confidence would be its mistake. Gray Hawk struck without warning, grabbing the snake behind its head with his left hand while driving the knife toward the base of its skull with his right. The serpent exploded into motion, its powerful body writhing and thrashing. Gray Hawk held on, his fingers digging into the thick scales as the snake tried to turn its fury on this new threat. The knife blade skittered off the snake's skull, drawing blood, but not finding the killing spot Gray Hawk needed. The creature's tail whipped around, catching him across the shoulders with enough force to nearly knock him down. But he didn't let go, couldn't let go. Tiva's life depended on his grip. Blood ran down Gray Hawk's arms where the snake's scales cut into his skin. His shoulders burned from the impact of its tail. The serpent was incredibly strong, its muscles like steel cables beneath the patterned hide. Gray Hawk felt his grip starting to slip and knew he had one chance left. Instead of trying to stab the snake again, he twisted the knife and began sawing at its neck, just behind the head. The blade was sharp enough to cut leather, sharp enough to part flesh and scale when driven by desperation and love. The snake's movements became more frantic as Gray Hawk worked, its coils loosening slightly around Tiva as it tried to deal with the threat at its head. That small loosening was enough. Tiva managed to get one front leg free and clawed at the snake's body, her wolf instincts finally overcoming panic. The combination of her struggles and Gray Hawk's relentless sawing began to tell. The snake's movements grew weaker, its grip on Tiva loosening further. Gray Hawk felt the moment when his blade found something vital inside the serpent's neck. The creature gave one final, massive convulsion that sent both man and wolf sprawling, then went limp. The silence that followed was broken only by Gray Hawk's ragged breathing and Tiva's whimpering. "It's over," Gray Hawk gasped, crawling toward his companion. "You're safe now." But Tiva wasn't safe. As Gray Hawk examined her in the fading light, he could see the damage the snake's coils had done. Her ribs showed darkening bruises where the constriction had been worst. She was breathing in short, painful gasps, and when she tried to stand, her back legs wouldn't support her weight. Gray Hawk's hands shook as he ran them gently over Tiva's body, using the field medicine skills he'd learned in the military to assess her injuries. No broken bones that he could detect, but internal damage was possible. Bleeding he couldn't see, organs that might have been crushed or torn. "I'm going to carry you home," he told her, his voice rough with emotion. "Everything's going to be fine." Tiva weighed nearly 100 pounds, but Gray Hawk lifted her as carefully as he would have lifted a human child. She whimpered when he moved her, and the sound cut through him like his own knife. He'd failed to protect her, failed to see the danger before it struck. The guilt was almost as heavy as her body in his arms. The walk back to the cabin took forever. Gray Hawk's arms and shoulders screamed with the effort of carrying Tiva's limp form over the rocky ground. Blood from his own wounds dripped steadily, leaving a trail that would attract scavengers later. But he didn't care about his injuries. All that mattered was getting Tiva home where he could properly tend to her wounds. By the time he reached the cabin, full darkness had fallen. Gray Hawk kicked open the door and carried Tiva inside, laying her gently on the thick rug in front of the fireplace. She was conscious, but weak. Her breathing still labored. In the lamplight, Gray Hawk could see that her injuries were even worse than he'd feared. The snake's coils had left deep impressions in her fur, dark lines that showed where incredible pressure had been applied. Her tongue was slightly blue, indicating that her circulation had been compromised. Most worrying of all, she couldn't seem to move her hindquarters without pain. Gray Hawk's hands moved automatically, checking her pulse, listening to her breathing, gently probing for signs of internal bleeding. His medical supplies were limited, mostly bandages, antiseptic, and pain medication left over from his own military injuries. Nothing that could help with whatever damage might have been done inside Tiva's body. As he worked, Gray Hawk found himself talking to her the way he had when she was a pup. Soft, reassuring words in both English and Apache, promises that everything would be all right, even though he wasn't sure he believed them himself. "You're going to be fine," he whispered, stroking her head. "Tomorrow you'll be chasing jackrabbits again. You'll see." But privately, Gray Hawk wondered if Tiva would live through the night. The snake had been larger than anything he'd ever seen in the desert, and its grip had been like a vice. Tiva was strong, but she was also hurt worse than any creature should have to endure and still survive. He built up the fire to keep her warm and settled beside her on the floor, one hand resting on her chest to monitor her breathing. It was going to be a long night, and Gray Hawk knew sleep wouldn't come. All he could do was watch over his companion and hope that her wild heart was strong enough to carry her through until morning. Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the scent of the dead snake across the mesa. By dawn, scavengers would have found the massive carcass and begun their work. But that seemed like it belonged to another world now. Gray Hawk's entire universe had narrowed to this room, this firelight, and the rise and fall of Tiva's labored breathing. The hunting knife lay cleaned and sheathed on the table beside him, returned to its proper place. It had done its job, saved the life that mattered most to him, but Gray Hawk wondered if it had been enough, or if the damage was already too great to undo. Only time would tell, and time had never moved more slowly than it did that night. Gray Hawk woke to the sound of footsteps on his porch and a gentle knock at his door. Sunlight streamed through the windows, telling him he'd managed to doze despite his worry. Tiva lay beside him on the rug, breathing more steadily than she had during the night, though she still couldn't move her back legs without whimpering. The knock came again, patient but insistent. Gray Hawk had lived alone so long that visitors were rare events, and for a moment he considered not answering. But something about the rhythm of the knock, 3 soft taps, a pause, then 3 more, suggested this wasn't a casual call. He opened the door to find Maria Santos standing on his porch, a large basket balanced in her weathered hands. She was a small woman in her 70s, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that had seen enough of life to understand when words weren't necessary. "I heard what happened," she said simply. "May I come in?" Gray Hawk stepped aside, wondering how news of the snake attack had traveled so quickly. Maria set her basket on his kitchen table and moved toward Tiva with the confidence of someone who understood injured animals. "My grandson Carlos saw the blood trail this morning when he was checking our fence line," Maria explained, kneeling beside Tiva. "He followed it back toward your property and found that snake. Dios mío, I've never seen anything so large in all my years in this desert." She opened her basket and began removing items: jars of herbs, clean bandages, a thermos of something that smelled like soup. At the bottom was a small cloth pouch that rattled softly when she picked it up. "This is a tea blend my grandmother taught me to make," Maria said, holding up the pouch. "For animals that have been hurt badly, it helps with the pain and the healing." Gray Hawk watched her prepare the tea with practiced movements, measuring dried leaves and roots into a small pot. The herbs filled his cabin with a sweet, earthy scent that reminded him of his own grandmother's remedies. "I don't know if she'll drink it," he said. "Animals know what they need," Maria replied. "If the tea can help her, she'll take it." As if responding to their conversation, Tiva lifted her head slightly and sniffed toward the brewing tea. Her tail moved just enough to suggest interest, the first sign of her normal personality Gray Hawk had seen since the attack. While the tea steeped, Maria examined Tiva's injuries with gentle, experienced hands. She'd raised horses, cattle, and goats for decades, and her touch seemed to calm the injured wolf. "The bruising is bad, but I don't think anything is broken," she said finally. "The tea will help with the swelling. Time will do the rest, if we're lucky." "Why are you helping me?" Gray Hawk asked. The question came out more bluntly than he'd intended, but Maria didn't seem offended. "5 years ago, my husband Roberto was dying," she said, settling into one of Gray Hawk's kitchen chairs. "Cancer. The doctor said there was nothing more they could do, so I brought him home to spend his last weeks in peace." She paused to check the tea, then continued. "Roberto loved to sit on our porch in the evenings, watching the sunset. One night, he pointed toward your land and said he could see a man and a wolf walking together on the mesa. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, the way you moved together, like you were part of the same spirit." Gray Hawk remembered those evenings, though he hadn't known anyone was watching. He and Tiva had often paused on the high ground, silhouetted against the evening sky. "Roberto died 2 days later," Maria continued, "but he spent his last evenings talking about you and Tiva, about how much love he could see in the way you cared for each other. He said anyone who could love that deeply deserved to be loved back." She poured the tea into a shallow bowl and set it beside Tiva's head. The wolf sniffed cautiously, then began to lap at the liquid with her pink tongue. "Good girl," Maria murmured. "That's going to make you feel better." Gray Hawk felt something tight in his chest, beginning to loosen. For 5 years, he'd thought his grief and isolation had gone unnoticed by his neighbors. The idea that his love for Tiva had been seen, recognized, and appreciated by a dying man he'd never spoken to was almost overwhelming. "I brought soup, too," Maria said, unpacking more containers from her basket. "And Carlos said he'd come by later with some hay bales to make a more comfortable bed for Tiva. His wife Elena teaches at the high school. She heard about what happened and wanted to help too." "How did everyone find out so quickly?" Gray Hawk asked. Maria smiled. "Desert people know each other's business, even when they keep their distance. Carlos told Tom Richardson when he delivered feed this morning. Tom mentioned it to Dr. Williams when he stopped for gas in town. Sarah Chen heard about it at the post office. Word travels fast when something important happens." She stood and moved toward the door, but paused with her hand on the knob. "Gray Hawk, I know you value your privacy, but sometimes accepting help is the bravest thing a person can do." After she left, Gray Hawk sat beside Tiva and watched her drink the healing tea. The wolf's breathing had eased, and some of the tension had left her body. Whether it was the herbs or simply the passage of time, she seemed more comfortable than she had since the attack. An hour later, Carlos Santos arrived with his pickup truck loaded with clean hay bales. He was a man in his 30s with his grandmother's gentle manner and his grandfather's strength. Without being asked, he arranged the bales into a soft nest beside Gray Hawk's fireplace. "This will be easier on her joints while she recovers," Carlos explained. "My grandmother wanted me to tell you that the tea should be given 3 times a day until the swelling goes down." When Carlos had gone, Gray Hawk helped Tiva move from the hard floor to the haybed. She settled with a sigh that seemed to express relief, and for the first time since the attack, Gray Hawk began to believe she might truly recover. As evening approached, he sat beside Tiva's makeshift bed and tried to understand what was happening. For 5 years, he'd lived in careful isolation, avoiding the complications that came with human connection. But in the space of one day, that isolation had been gently invaded by people who seemed to understand his pain without needing him to explain it. Maria's herbal tea blend sat on his kitchen counter, tangible proof that kindness could bridge the gap between strangers. The haybed where Tiva rested showed that community could exist without demands or obligations. Sometimes people helped simply because help was needed. Gray Hawk had spent so long protecting himself from further loss that he'd forgotten how good it felt to be cared for. As he listened to Tiva's steady breathing and smelled the lingering scent of Maria's healing herbs, he wondered if his long winter of solitude might finally be coming to an end. The sound of a diesel engine rumbling up Gray Hawk's drive came just after noon the next day. Through his window, he watched a battered pickup truck approach, its bed loaded with what looked like veterinary supplies. The driver was Tom Richardson, a man Gray Hawk knew by sight but had never actually spoken to beyond polite nods. At the feed store, Tom was a big man in his 60s, weathered by decades of ranch work, with the kind of hands that had fixed everything from broken fence posts to broken bones. He moved slowly as he climbed down from his truck, favoring his left leg in a way that spoke of old injuries that never quite healed right. "Heard your wolf got tangled up with something nasty," Tom said without preamble. "Brought some things. That might help." He began unloading supplies from his truck bed: antiseptic solutions, pain medications safe for canines, special bandages designed for large animals, and a portable IV kit that looked like it belonged in a veterinary clinic. "You don't need to," Gray Hawk began, but Tom cut him off with a raised hand. "Course I don't need to," the older man said. "Question is whether I want to. And I do." Gray Hawk led him inside where Tiva lay on her haybed, alert but still unable to stand without help. Tom knelt beside her with surprising gentleness for such a large man, his experienced hands moving over her injuries with the confidence of someone who'd treated hurt animals before. "She's a fighter," Tom said after his examination. "Ribs are bruised but not broken. The paralysis in her hindquarters is probably temporary, swelling putting pressure on nerves. Give it time and proper care, she should make a full recovery." As Tom organized the medical supplies on Gray Hawk's kitchen table, something silver caught the light. It was a small military medal pinned to the inside of Tom's jacket, partially hidden by the lapel. Gray Hawk recognized it immediately. A Bronze Star, awarded for heroic or meritorious service in combat. "Vietnam?" Gray Hawk asked quietly. Tom's hands stilled. For a moment, the only sound in the cabin was Tiva's steady breathing. Then Tom reached into his jacket and pulled out the medal, holding it in his weathered palm. "1st Infantry Division, 1968 to 1970, he said. "You?" "Border Patrol, Special Operations, 1995 to 2005, Gray Hawk replied. "Different war, same ghosts." Something shifted in the air between them, an understanding that went deeper than words. Tom carefully pinned the Bronze Star back inside his jacket, but the moment of recognition had created a bridge that hadn't existed before. "Lost my boy in Afghanistan," Tom said, his voice rough. "Marine lieutenant killed by an IED outside Kandahar. That was 8 years ago, and some days it still feels like yesterday." Gray Hawk nodded. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Thing about losing people," Tom continued, "is it makes you appreciate the ones who are still here, that wolf of yours. She's family. I can see it in the way you look at her. Family's worth fighting for. They worked together in comfortable silence, setting up the IV to help Tiva stay hydrated and administering a mild pain reliever that would help her rest. Tom showed Gray Hawk how to monitor her vital signs, how to adjust the medication dosage based on her weight and condition, and how to recognize signs of improvement or decline. "I'll check back tomorrow," Tom said as he packed up his remaining supplies. "And I've got a friend, Doc Williams, retired veterinarian, who might want to take a look at her in a day or two." After Tom left, Gray Hawk sat beside Tiva and thought about the medal hidden in the rancher's jacket. He understood the impulse to keep such things private. His own military decorations were locked in a box he hadn't opened in years, too painful to display but too meaningful to discard. But Tom had chosen to share that part of his history, to acknowledge the common ground between them. The bronze star wasn't just a piece of metal, it was proof of sacrifice, of service, of the willingness to put others before self, even when the cost was high. That evening, as Gray Hawk gave Tiva her second dose of Maria's herbal tea, he heard the sound of more vehicles approaching. Through his window he could see headlights, not just one truck this time, but 3 or 4 vehicles parked at respectful distances from his cabin. The first knock came softly, and Gray Hawk opened the door to find a small group of men standing. On his porch, he recognized some faces, neighbors he'd seen at the post office, the grocery store, the feed supply, but he'd never spoken to any of them at length. "We heard about what happened," said a man Gray Hawk thought might be named Eddie Martinez. "Tom Richardson told us about the snake, about how you fought it off with just a knife. We wanted to check if you needed anything," added another man. "George Tanner," he introduced himself. "I run the auto shop in town." A third man stepped forward. "Jake Morrison. I fought in Iraq, second tour. Tom said you were military too." Gray Hawk looked at the group of faces in his porch light. Working men, veterans, neighbors who had their own struggles and responsibilities, but had chosen to drive out to his remote cabin in the darkness to offer help to someone they barely knew. "Tiva's doing better," Gray Hawk said finally. "Thank you for asking." "That's good to hear," Jake said. "Tom told us she means a lot to you." "Pets. They're not just pets, you know. They're family." The men stayed for only a few minutes, but their presence filled Gray Hawk's cabin with something it hadn't held in years, the warmth of being part of something larger than himself. These weren't strangers offering pity. They were men who understood loyalty, who recognized the bond between him and Tiva, who had come not because they had to, but because they wanted to. After they left, Gray Hawk returned to Tiva's bedside. The wolf's eyes were brighter than they'd been since the attack, and she managed to lift her head when he sat down beside her. "Looks like we're not as alone as we thought," he murmured, stroking her fur. "Tom's bronze star brought him here, and somehow that brought the others too." Tom Richardson's military medal had done more than identify him as a fellow veteran. It had opened a door to understanding, to shared experience, to the recognition that some bonds transcend the boundaries. People build around themselves. Gray Hawk was beginning to realize that his long isolation might have been protecting him from pain, but it had also been protecting him from healing. As Tiva's breathing settled into the peaceful rhythm of natural sleep, Gray Hawk wondered what tomorrow might bring. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to finding out. Gray Hawk woke on the 3rd morning to find Tiva trying to stand on her own. She managed to get her front legs under her and lift her chest, though her hindquarters still wouldn't cooperate. The effort left her panting, but her amber eyes held a determination that hadn't been there the day before. "Easy, girl," Gray Hawk murmured, helping her settle back onto the haybed. "You're healing, but don't push too hard." The sound of car doors slamming drew his attention to the window. A small convoy had arrived. Maria Santos's old sedan, Tom Richardson's pickup, and a bright yellow school bus that seemed wildly out of place in the desert landscape. Gray Hawk stepped onto his porch as the bus doors opened and a stream of children poured out, followed by a young Asian woman carrying a large canvas bag. The children ranged in age from about 6 to 12, chattering excitedly as they gathered around their teacher. Mr. Gray Hawk? The woman approached with a warm smile. I'm Sarah Chen from Desert Springs Elementary. These are some of my students. They heard about Tiva and wanted to do something to help her feel better. Sarah opened her canvas bag and began pulling out items. Dozens of handmade get-well cards covered in crayon drawings of wolves, snakes, and desert landscapes. There were also small gifts, carved wooden animals, painted rocks, and a beautiful patchwork blanket that looked like it had been made by many different hands. This quilt was my grandmother's, Sarah explained, holding up the blanket. She made it during the Depression, when times were hard and people had to take care of each other. I thought it might help keep Tiva warm while she recovers. A small boy with serious dark eyes stepped forward. Is she going to be okay? He asked. The wolf, I mean. My mom said snakes can hurt animals really bad. Gray Hawk knelt down to the boy's eye level. She's going to be fine, he said. Wolves are very strong, and she's getting lots of help from good people like you. Can we see her? Asked a girl with pigtails. We promised to be quiet. Gray Hawk looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Just for a minute, he said. She needs to rest. The children filed into his cabin with surprising reverence, their earlier excitement replaced by awed whispers. Tiva lifted her head as they approached, her ears pricked forward with interest rather than fear. She's beautiful, breathed a young girl. Look at her eyes, they're like gold. Is she really a wolf? Asked another child. She looks kind of like my dog Rex. Gray Hawk found himself explaining the differences between wolves and dogs, talking about Tiva's wild heritage and how she'd come to live with him. The children listened with rapt attention, asking thoughtful questions about desert animals and Apache culture. My great-grandfather was Apache too, said a boy named Miguel. He used to tell stories about talking to animals. Can you talk to Tiva? In a way, Gray Hawk said. Not with words like we're using now, but wolves and people can understand each other if they pay attention. One of the older girls held up a card she'd made, a drawing of a man and a wolf standing together on a mountain. Is this you and Tiva? She asked. Gray Hawk studied the picture, surprised by how accurately it captured something essential about his relationship with the wolf. Yes, he said. That's exactly what we look like when we're walking together. The girl beamed with pride. I wanted to show that you're friends. Real friends help each other when there's trouble. Sarah began gathering the children after about 10 minutes, but before they left, she approached Gray Hawk with a request that surprised him. The children have been studying desert ecology this semester, she said. They're fascinated by what you've told them about wolves and Apache traditions. Would you consider coming to our school sometime to talk to them? We could arrange it for after Tiva is fully recovered. Gray Hawk felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the instinct to decline, to maintain his distance. But looking at the eager faces of the children, remembering their genuine interest and respect, he found himself nodding. I'd like that, he said, surprising himself with the truth of it. After the bus pulled away, Gray Hawk spread Sarah's grandmother's quilt over Tiva's haybed. The patchwork was made from dozens of different fabrics, pieces of old dresses, work shirts, kitchen curtains, each square telling the story of a family's daily life during hard times. Tiva seemed to appreciate the softness, settling into the quilt with a contented sigh. The children's cards were scattered around the cabin now, their bright colors and innocent artistry transforming the space in ways Gray Hawk hadn't expected. Maria Santos had stayed behind after the others left, quietly, organizing the gifts and making fresh tea for Tiva. Those children see something special in you, she observed. Sarah Chen is a good teacher. She wouldn't bring them here if she didn't trust you completely. I haven't talked to children in years, Gray Hawk admitted. Not since... He stopped, the memory of his daughter Sophie still too painful to voice. Children have a way of healing old wounds, Maria said gently. They don't see the past or worry about the future. They just see who you are right now, in this moment. That evening, as Gray Hawk read through the get-well cards, he was struck by the children's artwork. Many of them had drawn him as a heroic figure, fighting the snake to save his wolf friend. Others showed him and Tiva living peacefully in the desert, surrounded by the beauty of their homeland. But the image that stayed with him was Miguel's drawing, a simple picture of hands reaching toward each other, with the words, "Helping is how we show love," written in careful block letters below. Sarah's grandmother's quilt had been made during the Depression, when communities had to pull together to survive. Now it was warming an injured wolf, while her owner discovered that his own community had been waiting patiently for him to rejoin it. As Gray Hawk settled beside Tiva for another night of watching over her recovery, he realized that the children's visit had given him something he hadn't expected to find again, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own healing. They saw him as a teacher, a keeper of traditions and knowledge that could enrich their understanding of the world. The quilt represented more than just warmth and comfort. It was proof that care passed down through generations, that communities endured by taking care of their own, and that sometimes the most beautiful things came from many different hands working together toward a common purpose. For the first time since his family's death, Gray Hawk began to imagine a future that included more than just survival. Dr. Williams arrived on the fourth day, his weathered medical bag in one hand and his old stethoscope draped around his neck like a badge of long service. He was a thin man in his 70s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the careful movements of someone who'd spent decades examining patients, both human and animal. "Tom Richardson asked me to take a look at your wolf," he said, setting his bag down beside Tiva's makeshift bed. "I'm officially retired, but I still make exceptions for special cases." Gray Hawk watched as Dr. Williams examined Tiva with gentle, practiced hands. The old physician listened to her heart and lungs through his stethoscope, checked her reflexes, and carefully palpated her injured ribs. Tiva tolerated the examination with patient dignity, seeming to understand that this man meant to help her. "Her vital signs are strong," Dr. Williams reported. "The swelling in her spinal cord is going down. That's why she's starting to get some feeling back in her hindquarters. The bruising on her ribs is healing well. Whoever's been taking care of her has done an excellent job." Maria Santos brought herbs for tea, and Tom provided the medical supplies, Gray Hawk said. Dr. Williams nodded approvingly. "Traditional remedies combined with modern medicine, that's often the best approach. You clearly know what you're doing with field medicine yourself. Where did you learn?" "Military medic training," Gray Hawk replied. "Border patrol unit. We had to be ready to treat anything from gunshot wounds to snake bites in remote locations." The old doctor's eyes lit up with interest. "Combat medic experience is invaluable out here. We're 40 miles from the nearest hospital and emergencies don't wait for convenient timing." He paused, studying Gray Hawk carefully. "Would you be interested in helping me train some of the local folks in basic emergency response?" "Nothing fancy, just enough knowledge to keep someone alive until proper help can arrive." Gray Hawk felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that came with commitments to other people. But looking at Dr. Williams's earnest face, at his stethoscope that represented decades of healing and service, he found himself considering the possibility. "What kind of training?" he asked. "Basic trauma care, recognition of serious injuries, how to treat shock and blood loss, desert survival medicine," Dr. Williams explained. "I've been trying to get a program started for years, but I needed someone with real field experience to help make it practical. Your military background, combined with your knowledge of this terrain, would be perfect." Dr. Williams opened his medical bag and began pulling out supplies. Advanced bandages, emergency medications, a portable defibrillator that looked remarkably sophisticated for such a rural area. "The state gave us a grant for emergency medical equipment," he explained. "But equipment is useless without people who know how to use it properly. Tom Richardson, Maria Santos, Sarah Chen, they're all willing to learn. We just need someone to teach them." Gray Hawk thought about the people who had come to help Tiva, about their genuine desire to take care of their community. "When would you want to start?" After your wolf is fully recovered, Dr. Williams said. No rush. But Gray Hawk, this community needs what you have to offer. Your skills could save lives. As if responding to the conversation, Tiva managed to shift her weight and move her back legs slightly. It was the most movement Gray Hawk had seen from her hindquarters since the attack. That's a very good sign, Dr. Williams observed, listening to her heart again through his stethoscope. I think she's going to make a complete recovery. Wolves are remarkably resilient creatures. After the doctor left, Gray Hawk sat beside Tiva and thought about the offer. For years, his medical knowledge had been something he carried like old baggage, useful skills he'd hoped never to need again, memories of treating wounded soldiers in conditions no medic should have to face. But Dr. Williams saw those same skills as gifts that could serve his new community. The stethoscope around the old physician's neck represented a lifetime of using knowledge to help others, of finding purpose in service rather than dwelling on past pain. That afternoon, Tom Richardson returned with Jake Morrison and two other men Gray Hawk hadn't met before. They introduced themselves as veterans from different conflicts: Eddie Martinez from the Gulf War, George Tanner from Somalia, men who understood both the value of medical training and the weight of military experience. Doc Williams told us about the emergency response idea, Jake said. We're all interested in learning. Living out here, we need to be prepared for anything. Had a ranch hand get kicked by a horse last year, Tom added. Took an hour for the ambulance to reach us. If we'd known more about treating head injuries, might have made a difference in his recovery. The men stayed for an hour, discussing the kinds of emergencies they'd encountered in their remote area: vehicle accidents on isolated roads, hunting injuries, equipment accidents on ranches and construction sites. Gray Hawk found himself sharing stories about field medicine, explaining techniques he'd learned for treating trauma in difficult conditions. You make it sound simple, Eddie observed, but I bet it's harder than you're letting on. The techniques aren't complicated, Gray Hawk said. The hard part is staying calm when someone's life depends on what you do next. That comes with practice and preparation. As the conversation continued, Gray Hawk realized he was enjoying himself. These men respected his knowledge without making him feel like a curiosity. They asked practical questions about medical procedures, listened carefully to his answers, and shared their own experiences with rural emergencies. When they left, George Tanner lingered behind for a moment. My daughter goes to Sarah Chen's school, he said. She came home talking about the Apache man with the wolf, about how you explained the difference between wild animals and pets. Made quite an impression on her. Children ask good questions, Gray Hawk replied. They do, George. Agreed. And they remember the people who take time to answer them properly. That matters more than you might think. That evening, as Gray Hawk helped Tiva take her first tentative steps in days, he reflected on how much his world had expanded in less than a week. Dr. Williams's stethoscope had opened another door, this one leading toward a future where his painful military experiences could be transformed into tools for healing rather than sources of nightmares. Tiva's recovery was mirroring his own in ways he was only beginning to understand. Her injured body was healing through the care of others, just as his isolated heart was being mended by unexpected connections to his community. The stethoscope represented more than medical expertise. It symbolized the bridge between different kinds of healing, the merger of traditional knowledge with modern techniques, and the possibility that his hardest experiences might become his greatest gifts to others. As he watched Tiva take careful steps across his cabin floor, Gray Hawk began to believe that some wounds, given enough time and care, could not only heal, but make you stronger than you were before. The emergency call came at dawn on Tiva's 8th day of recovery, tearing Gray Hawk from sleep with its urgent ringing. Tom Richardson's voice crackled through the old landline, tight with fear. Gray Hawk, we need your help. Sarah Chen's nephew got caught in the flash flood down by Copper Canyon, the boys trapped on a ledge about halfway down the cliff face, and the water's still rising. Search and rescue is 2 hours out, but we don't think he's got that long. Gray Hawk was already pulling on his boots. How old is the boy? 8 years old. Name's David. He was camping with his uncle when the storm hit. The uncle made it out, but David got separated in the current. Through his window, Gray Hawk could see the evidence of the previous night's sudden storm. Puddles of standing water that would be gone by noon, debris scattered by flash flooding that could turn a dry wash into a raging torrent in minutes. Desert storms were like that, violent and brief, but capable of reshaping the landscape in hours. "I'm coming," Gray Hawk said. "Meet me at the canyon access road." He looked at Tiva, who had lifted her head at the sound of activity. She could walk short distances now, but she was still weak, still healing. Leaving her felt like abandoning family, but a child's life was at stake. "I have to go," he told her, stroking her fur. "I'll be back as soon as I can." Gray Hawk gathered his gear with the automatic efficiency of old training: rope, first aid supplies, emergency blanket, water. Then he stopped, looking at an old wooden box he hadn't opened in years. Inside were items he'd inherited from his grandfather, sacred things he'd put away after losing his family because they reminded him too painfully of who he used to be. But if he was going to save a child using skills that went deeper than military training, he would need more than modern equipment. He would need the wisdom his grandfather had tried to teach him about reading the desert, about moving through dangerous terrain, about finding people who were lost. Gray Hawk opened the box and pulled out his grandfather's medicine bundle, a leather pouch containing items that had been blessed for protection and healing. Eagle feathers for vision, sage for purification, small stones from sacred places, and a piece of turquoise that had been in his family for generations. He hadn't carried these things in over a decade, hadn't trusted himself to be worthy of their power since his family died. But David Chen was trapped and dying, and Gray Hawk's modern skills alone might not be enough to reach him. The drive to Copper Canyon took 20 minutes on dirt roads, still muddy from the storm. When Gray Hawk arrived, he found a small crowd gathered at the canyon's edge: Tom Richardson, Sarah Chen, Dr. Williams, and several other neighbors. Sarah's face was streaked with tears, and she clutched Gray Hawk's arm the moment he stepped out of his truck. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. "David is my sister's boy. He's visiting for the summer, and I was supposed to be watching him." "This isn't your fault," Gray Hawk said firmly. "Flash floods are nobody's fault. Show me where he is." Tom led him to the canyon's edge, where Gray Hawk could see the situation clearly. The normally dry creek bed was now a rushing torrent of brown water, carrying debris from miles upstream. About 60 feet down the cliff face, a small figure clung to a narrow ledge, barely wide enough to hold him. The boy was conscious, but clearly exhausted, his clothes soaked, his grip on the wet rock growing weaker by the minute. "The ledge is solid," Tom reported, "but the water's still rising, and that rock face is slick from the rain. Professional rescue team would use helicopters and specialized equipment. We don't have that kind of time." Gray Hawk studied the cliff face, reading the rock formations the way his grandfather had taught him to read the entire landscape as a map. There, a route down that would be invisible to most people, but clear to someone who understood how water moved, how stone weathered, how to find handholds that had been carved by centuries of wind and rain. "I can reach him," Gray Hawk said, "but I'll need to do this the old way, not the military way." He pulled the medicine bundle from his pack, feeling the weight of tradition and responsibility in his hands. Sarah watched with wide eyes as he opened the pouch and removed a pinch of sage, burning it briefly with a match and letting the smoke drift toward the canyon. "What are you doing?" Dr. Williams asked. "Asking for protection," Gray Hawk replied simply. "For the boy, for me, and for everyone who's trying to help." He tied the medicine bundle to his belt and began his descent, moving with fluid grace that seemed to defy the treacherous conditions. This wasn't the rappelling technique he'd learned in the military. This was something older, a way of moving through dangerous terrain that his ancestors had perfected long before there were ropes or modern climbing equipment. Gray Hawk used Every crack in the stone, every natural handhold, every slight irregularity in the cliff face. He moved like water finding its way downhill, always taking the path that required the least fight against the rock's natural structure. Halfway down, he could hear David crying. The boy had seen him coming and was calling out in a mixture of hope and terror. "I'm here," Gray Hawk called back. "Don't try to move, I'm coming to get you." The final 20 feet were the most dangerous. The rock here was wet from spray thrown up by the rushing water below, and the handholds were smaller, more precarious. Gray Hawk touched the medicine bundle at his belt and felt his grandfather's presence, the accumulated wisdom of generations who had survived in this harsh landscape. When he reached the ledge, David threw his arms around Gray Hawk's neck with desperate strength. The boy was shivering from cold and shock, his lips blue, his small body pressed against the rock face. "I thought nobody was coming," David sobbed. "The water kept getting higher, and I couldn't climb back up, and I was so scared." "You're safe now," Gray Hawk said, wrapping the emergency blanket around the boy's shoulders. "But I need you to be very brave for a few more minutes while I get us both back up to the top." Getting down had been difficult. Getting back up with an exhausted 8-year-old would be nearly impossible using conventional methods. But Gray Hawk's grandfather had taught him that the desert always provided what you needed if you knew how to see it. He secured David to his chest with rope, then began the ascent using a route he'd spotted on the way down, a series of natural steps and handholds that formed an ancient pathway up the canyon wall. It was longer than the direct route he'd used to descend, but it was safer for carrying another person. The climb took almost an hour. Gray Hawk moved slowly, carefully, stopping frequently to let David rest and to make sure his grip was secure. The medicine bundle seemed to grow heavier as they climbed, as if it were absorbing the weight of responsibility and transforming it into strength. When they finally reached the top, Sarah caught David in her arms and burst into tears. Dr. Williams immediately began checking the boy for injuries, while the gathered neighbors cheered and clapped. But Gray Hawk barely heard the celebration. The sacred items in his medicine bundle had reconnected him to something he'd lost when his family died. His role as a protector, a keeper of ancient wisdom, someone who could bridge the gap between old ways and new needs. Tom Richardson gripped his shoulder. "That was incredible. How did you know that route existed?" "My grandfather taught me to read the landscape," Gray Hawk said. "Every canyon tells a story about how water has moved through it for thousands of years. If you know how to listen, the rocks will show you the safe paths." As they drove David to town for proper medical evaluation, Gray Hawk realized that the rescue had changed something fundamental inside him. The medicine bundle hadn't just helped him save a child, it had restored his connection to his heritage, his understanding of his place in the community. For years, he'd hidden his Apache traditions because they reminded him of everything he'd lost. But today, those same traditions had allowed him to give a family the gift he hadn't been able to give his own. A child returned safely home. The medicine bundle represented more than sacred objects. It was the bridge between his past and his future, between the man who had lost everything and the man who was discovering he still had much to give. Word of David Chen's rescue spread through the community faster than the flash flood that had caused the crisis. By the time Gray Hawk returned home that evening, he found his driveway full of vehicles and his front yard dotted with neighbors who had come to express their gratitude and amazement. Tiva greeted him at the door with her strongest steps yet, her tail wagging with an energy that hadn't been there since before the snake attack. The sight of her improvement combined with the successful rescue filled Gray Hawk with a hope he hadn't felt in years. "You saved my nephew's life," Sarah Chen said, approaching with tears in her eyes. "David told me about the ceremony you performed, about how you moved down that cliff like you were part of the mountain itself. He said you weren't just climbing, you were dancing with the rocks." Tom Richardson stepped forward, his expression serious. "Gray Hawk, what you did today, That wasn't just skill, that was something deeper. The way you read that canyon, found a path nobody else could see. We need to talk. Over the next hour, as the crowd of neighbors gradually thinned, a core group remained. Tom Richardson, Maria Santos, Dr. Williams, Sarah Chen, and several others who had become regular presences in Gray Hawk's life since Tiva's injury. They gathered on his porch and began discussing something that surprised him. "We've been talking," Tom said, "all of us separately and together, about what this community needs, about the resources we have, about the knowledge that's been sitting right here under our noses." Dr. Williams leaned forward in his chair. "Gray Hawk, you have skills this community desperately needs. Medical training, search and rescue experience, traditional knowledge about this land that nobody else possesses. We'd like to propose something." Maria Santos opened a thermos and began pouring coffee into mugs she'd brought from her own kitchen. "We want to make your place a community gathering spot," she said. "Not just for emergencies, but for learning, for sharing knowledge, for bringing people together." Sarah Chen nodded enthusiastically. "You could teach the children about desert survival, about Apache culture, about respecting the land. The adults could learn emergency medicine from you and Dr. Williams. We could have regular meetings here, plan community projects, support each other the way neighbors should." Gray Hawk felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the fear of commitment, of opening himself to potential loss again. For 5 years, his isolation had been both prison and protection. The idea of deliberately inviting people into his life, of making himself responsible for others' well-being, terrified him. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that." Tom Richardson studied him with understanding eyes. "Nobody's asking you to decide tonight," he said. "But think about it. Today proved that your skills can save lives. That knowledge you carry, it's too valuable to keep locked away." Dr. Williams stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the desert landscape. "I'm 73 years old," he said. "I won't be able to handle medical emergencies in this area much longer. You're the only person I've met who has both the training and the judgment to take over some of that responsibility. And the children," Sarah added, "they're fascinated by what you know about this land. Traditional knowledge like yours, it's disappearing. If you don't share it, who will?" After everyone had gone home, Gray Hawk sat on his porch with Tiva curled beside him, her head resting on his lap. The desert night was clear and quiet, stars brilliant in the unpolluted sky. This was the time he usually treasured most, the peaceful solitude that had sustained him through years of grief. But tonight the silence felt different. Instead of comforting, it seemed somehow incomplete, as if it were waiting for voices, for laughter, for the sounds of community that had begun to fill his life over the past week and a half. The next morning brought more visitors. Carlos Santos arrived with materials to build a fire pit in Gray Hawk's yard, a permanent gathering place that could host larger groups. Jake Morrison and Eddie Martinez came with tools to help with the construction, treating it as a given that Gray Hawk would agree to the community plan. "You don't have to decide today," Carlos said, as he began arranging stones in a circle. "But we figured we'd build this anyway. Even if you only use it for yourself and Tiva, it'll be nice to have." George Tanner arrived with his daughter Amy, the girl who had asked about talking to animals. She had brought a new drawing, this one showing Gray Hawk teaching a group of children beside a fire, with Tiva sitting nearby like a guardian spirit. "Will you really come to our school?" Amy asked. "I told my friends about how you saved that boy, about how you knew secret paths down the mountain. They all want to meet you." Gray Hawk looked at the drawing, at the hope in Amy's eyes, at the fire pit taking shape in his yard. These people weren't just asking him to share his knowledge, they were creating a space for it, making it easy for him to say yes. But saying yes meant accepting responsibility for others' safety and well-being. It meant becoming essential to people who might be taken away from him, just as his family had been taken. The fear of that loss was almost paralyzing. That afternoon, as the fire pit neared completion, Tiva managed to walk all the way around the yard without assistance. Her recovery was almost complete, a testament to the community care that had surrounded them both. Watching her move with growing strength and confidence, Gray Hawk realized that isolation hadn't protected either of them. It had simply delayed their healing. Maria Santos noticed his thoughtful mood as she served lunch to the volunteers, working on the fire pit. "You're thinking too hard," she observed. "Sometimes the heart knows what the mind is afraid to accept." "What if I fail them?" Gray Hawk asked quietly. "What if someone gets hurt because I made a mistake, or because my knowledge wasn't enough?" "What if you succeed?" Maria countered. "What if your knowledge saves lives, teaches children to respect their heritage, brings this community together in ways that make everyone stronger?" Dr. Williams overheard their conversation and joined them. "Gray Hawk, in 40 years of practicing medicine, I've learned something important. The fear of making mistakes can paralyze you, but it can also make you more careful, more thoughtful. Your military experience taught you that same lesson." That evening, as the fire pit was completed and the volunteers had gone home, Gray Hawk built the first fire in the new gathering place. Tiva settled beside him on the sand, her recovery so complete that she seemed stronger than before the attack. The flames danced against the desert darkness, creating a circle of warmth and light that seemed to extend an invitation to the surrounding landscape. This was how his ancestors had gathered for centuries, around fires that brought people together, sharing stories and wisdom that helped communities survive and thrive. Gray Hawk reached into his shirt and pulled out his grandfather's medicine bundle, which he had carried since the rescue. The sacred objects inside had helped him save David Chen, had reconnected him to traditions he'd thought were lost forever. But they had done something else as well. They had shown him that his knowledge and skills were not burdens to be carried alone, but gifts meant to be shared with others who needed them. The community fire pit represented more than just a place to gather. It was a symbol of permanent belonging, of his acceptance into a network of mutual care and responsibility. It was also a challenge, an invitation to step out of the safety of isolation and into the risks and rewards of true community. As the fire burned down to glowing coals, Gray Hawk made his decision. Tomorrow, he would tell his neighbors that he was ready to become what they needed him to be: teacher, healer, keeper of traditions, and guardian of community knowledge. The fire pit would not remain empty for long. The celebration began at sunset 2 weeks later, when Tiva was completely healed, and Gray Hawk had officially agreed to become the community's teacher and emergency response coordinator. Cars and trucks arrived from all directions, parking in a careful semicircle around the new fire pit that had become the heart of an unexpected gathering place. Gray Hawk stood beside the fire as his neighbors approached, carrying dishes of food, blankets to sit on, and musical instruments that suggested this would be more than just a simple dinner. Tiva moved among the arrivals with confident steps, accepting pets and treats from people who had watched over her recovery. Sarah Chen arrived with her entire extended family, including David, the 8-year-old, whose rescue had marked the turning point in Gray Hawk's willingness to rejoin his community. The boy ran straight to Tiva, who had become something of a celebrity among the local children. "She looks perfect," David announced, wrapping his arms around the wolf's neck, "just like she did before the snake hurt her." Tom Richardson and his wife brought a guitar, and Jake Morrison carried a harmonica. Dr. Williams arrived with his medical bag, as always, but also with a bottle of wine he'd been saving for a special occasion. Maria Santos and her family brought enough food to feed twice as many people, including fresh tortillas and a pot of green chili that filled the evening air with spicy aromas. As the fire grew brighter and the circle of people expanded, Gray Hawk felt a mixture of nervousness and joy that reminded him of celebrations from his youth, when his extended family would gather for ceremonies and storytelling that lasted long into the night. "Before we eat," Tom Richardson said, standing beside the fire, "I think we should acknowledge what brought us all together. 2 weeks ago, Gray Hawk fought a giant snake to save Tiva's life. That act of courage started something none of us expected, a community. The gathered neighbors nodded and murmured agreement. Gray Hawk felt his face warm with more than just heat from the fire. Dr. Williams stood next. What impressed me most wasn't the snake fight. Though that was remarkable, it was watching Gray Hawk care for Tiva afterward, seeing how much love and knowledge he brought to her healing. That's when I knew he was someone this community needed. Sarah Chen rose with David still clinging to her side. Gray Hawk saved my nephew's life, using skills I didn't even know existed. But more than that, he's agreed to teach our children about this land, about traditions that connect us to something larger than ourselves. One by one, others stood to speak. Maria Santos talked about the healing traditions she and Gray Hawk had shared. Carlos Santos mentioned the emergency response training that would make everyone safer. Even shy Amy Tanner stood up to read a poem. She'd written about wolves and friendship and brave people who helped others. But it was Tiva who provided the evening's most powerful moment. As the testimonials continued, she moved to the center of the circle and released a long, triumphant howl that echoed across the desert landscape. The sound was pure joy, pure strength, a victory song that announced to the world that she had not just survived, but thrived. The howl seemed to call something forth from the gathered neighbors. Children stopped their playing to listen in wonder. Adults felt tears spring to their eyes without quite understanding why. Even the desert seemed to hold its breath as Tiva's voice carried across the mesa, beautiful and wild and completely free. That's the sound of healing, Dr. Williams said softly when the echoes faded, not just for Tiva, but for all of us. Gray Hawk looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight, people who had been strangers 2 weeks ago, but were now something like family. Maria Santos smiled at him with the warmth of a grandmother. Tom Richardson nodded with the respect of one veteran acknowledging another. Sarah Chen watched her nephew pet Tiva with the gratitude of someone whose worst fear had been transformed into deepest blessing. When it was time for Gray Hawk to speak, he found himself thinking of his grandfather's words about the responsibility that came with knowledge, about the importance of passing wisdom from one generation to the next. 2 weeks ago, I thought I was living the life I was meant to live, he began, his voice carrying clearly in the desert silence. Alone, safe, protected from any more loss or pain. But Tiva's injury taught me something I'd forgotten. That love requires courage, and courage means accepting the risk of loss for the chance of connection. He paused, stroking Tiva's head as she settled beside him. All of you took that risk when you came to help us. You didn't know me, had no reason to care about my wolf, but you showed up anyway. You taught me that community isn't something you fall into by accident. It's something you build, one act of kindness at a time. The fire crackled and sparked, sending embers drifting up toward the star-filled sky. Gray Hawk felt the weight of the moment, the importance of the commitment he was about to make. I accept your invitation to become your teacher, your emergency response coordinator, and your neighbor in the fullest sense of that word, he said. My knowledge is yours to share. My skills are yours to use. My home is yours for gathering, for learning, for celebrating the bonds that make us stronger than we could ever be alone. The applause that followed Gray Hawk's speech was warm but brief, as if the gathered neighbors understood that this moment called for something more meaningful than clapping. Instead, Sarah Chen stepped forward, carrying a long object wrapped in soft deer skin. We have something for you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. All of us worked on this together, the adults and the children, everyone who wanted to show you what your acceptance means to us. Gray Hawk unwrapped the deerskin carefully, revealing a beautifully carved wooden staff about 5 feet long. The wood was polished juniper, smooth as silk under his fingers, and carved with intricate symbols that told the story of the past 2 weeks. A wolf, a snake, a man with outstretched hands, children learning, adults helping, all connected by flowing lines that suggested wind and water and the eternal movement of desert life. Tom Richardson carved the basic shape, Sarah explained. Dr. Williams added the medical symbols. Maria Santos burned in the traditional Apache patterns. The children each added their own small touches. Carlos Santos polished it until it felt like water in your hands. Gray Hawk turned the staff slowly, discovering new details with each rotation. Near the top, Amy Tanner had carved a tiny figure of a man and wolf walking together. Halfway down, David Chen had added his own mark, 2 hands reaching toward each. The same symbol he'd drawn in his Get Well card for Tiva. It's a teaching staff, Tom Richardson said. Something you can carry when you're instructing the children, when you're leading emergency response training, when you're sharing the old stories around the fire. A symbol of the knowledge you're willing to share with us. Gray Hawk felt the weight of the staff in his hands, not just its physical mass, but the accumulated love and effort that had gone into its creation. This wasn't just a gift. It was a formal recognition of his new role in the community, a tangible reminder of the responsibilities he was accepting. I don't know what to say, he managed, his voice rough with emotion. Say you'll use it well, Maria Santos said. Say you'll carry it proudly when you teach our children about their heritage, when you help us learn to take care of each other. I will, Gray Hawk promised, raising the staff toward the starlit sky. I swear on my grandfather's memory and on Tiva's life, I will use this knowledge to serve this community as long as I'm able. Jake Morrison brought out his harmonica and began playing a slow, haunting melody that seemed to capture both the sadness of the past and the hope of the future. Others joined in, Tom Richardson on guitar, Maria Santos humming harmony, children clapping softly in rhythm. As the music filled the desert night, Gray Hawk walked around the circle with his new teaching staff, stopping to thank each person individually for their part in Tiva's healing and his own transformation. The children hugged him shyly. The adults shook his hand or embraced him with the warmth of family. Dr. Williams was the last person in the circle, and when Gray Hawk reached him, the old physician smiled with satisfaction. You know what this means, don't you? Dr. Williams said quietly. You're officially the keeper of this community's well-being now. Medical emergencies, search and rescue, cultural education, conflict resolution. People will come to you when they need help. I understand, Gray Hawk replied, and I'm ready. Are you? Dr. Williams asked, but his tone was gentle, testing rather than doubting. Because once people depend on you this way, there's no going back to isolation. You'll be part of their lives and they'll be part of yours, for better and worse. Gray Hawk looked around the circle of faces, people who had risked caring about a stranger and his injured wolf, who had opened their hearts despite not knowing if their concern would be welcomed or rejected, people who had chosen community over safety, connection over comfort. 5 years ago, I thought caring about others would destroy me, he said. I was wrong. It's isolation that destroys. Caring even when it hurts is what makes us human. Tiva rose from where she'd been lying beside the fire and moved to Gray Hawk's side, pressing her warm body against his leg. She looked up at him with amber eyes that held complete trust, complete love, complete acceptance of whatever came next. The teaching staff felt perfectly balanced in Gray Hawk's grip, as if it had been waiting his entire life for this moment. He understood now that his grandfather's medicine bundle had been preparing him for this role, that his military training had been building skills he would use to protect civilians rather than fight enemies, that even his years of grief had been teaching him empathy for others who suffered loss. Tomorrow we start, he announced to the gathered community. Emergency response training for the adults, desert ecology lessons for the children, regular gatherings here around this fire. We're going to build something that lasts, something that makes us all stronger. The celebration continued late into the night, with stories and songs and laughter that carried across the mesa like a promise. Gray Hawk held his teaching staff and felt, for the first time since his family's death, that he was exactly where he belonged. 3 months later, the desert dawn broke over a landscape transformed not by any physical change, but by the human connections that now crisscrossed it like invisible threads of care and mutual responsibility. Gray Hawk woke, as he always had, to the sound of Tiva stirring beside his bed, but now their morning routine included preparations for the day's community activities. Tiva had become more than just his companion. She was now the unofficial mascot and therapy animal for the entire neighborhood. Children who visited for desert ecology lessons would seek her out for comfort when they scraped a knee or felt homesick during overnight camping trips. Adults attending emergency response training sessions would pause to pet her soft fur, finding that her calm presence helped them focus during stressful medical simulations. Gray Hawk's teaching staff leaned against the wall beside his bed, polished smooth by constant use. He carried it everywhere now, to the elementary school where he taught traditional Apache stories, to the community center where he led wilderness survival courses, to the homes of neighbors who called him for help with everything from injured livestock to family disputes. The emergency response training had proven its worth just 6 weeks after it began. When George Tanner suffered a heart attack while working on his ranch, his daughter Amy knew to call Gray Hawk immediately, while her mother performed the CPR techniques they'd all learned around the fire pit. Gray Hawk had arrived with Dr. Williams's advanced medical kit and kept George stable until the ambulance reached them. The doctors later said that the community's quick, knowledgeable response had saved George's life, that success had brought requests for training from other rural communities, and Gray Hawk now traveled throughout the region, teaching emergency medical skills to ranchers, miners, and small-town residents who lived far from hospitals. His reputation as someone who could bridge traditional knowledge with modern techniques had spread beyond his immediate neighborhood. But it was the children who brought Gray Hawk the deepest satisfaction. Every Saturday, a group of young people gathered at his fire pit for lessons that went far beyond simple nature facts. Gray Hawk taught them to read animal tracks, to identify edible and medicinal plants, to understand weather patterns, and to move through the landscape with the respectful awareness that his grandfather had passed down to him. David Chen, the boy Gray Hawk had rescued from the flash flood, had become one of his most dedicated students. The 8-year-old showed a natural aptitude for tracking and had already helped locate 2 lost pets using skills Gray Hawk had taught him about following scent trails and reading disturbed ground. Amy Tanner, now 9 years old, had discovered a talent for identifying medicinal plants. She worked closely with Maria Santos to create an herb garden beside Gray Hawk's cabin, learning both the traditional Apache names for healing plants and the modern scientific understanding of how they worked. Miguel Martinez, the boy who had asked about talking to animals, was developing an uncanny ability to calm frightened livestock and wild creatures. Gray Hawk suspected the child had inherited some of the intuitive connection with animals that ran in certain families, and he was carefully nurturing that gift. Sarah Chen had integrated Gray Hawk's teachings into her school curriculum and test. Scores in science and social studies had improved dramatically as children became excited about learning through hands-on experience with their local environment. The State Education Department had asked her to document her teaching methods for possible implementation in other rural schools. Dr. Williams had officially retired, confident that Gray Hawk could handle most medical emergencies that arose in their remote area. The old physician still consulted on complex cases, but he spent most of his time now teaching advanced medical techniques to Gray Hawk and helping him establish connections with specialists at regional hospitals. Tom Richardson had become Gray Hawk's closest friend and most trusted advisor. The two veterans had discovered that their different military experiences complemented each other perfectly. Tom's leadership skills balanced Gray Hawk's technical expertise, creating an effective partnership for organizing community projects and emergency responses. Maria Santos continued to provide wisdom and emotional support for the entire neighborhood, but she had also become Gray Hawk's link to the broader Hispanic community in the region. Through her connections, he'd been invited to share traditional Apache knowledge with other indigenous and Latino groups, building cultural bridges that enriched everyone involved. On this particular morning, as Gray Hawk prepared for another day of teaching and community service, he paused on his porch to watch the sun rise over the sacred mountains to the east. The desert stretched before him in all directions, unchanged in its fundamental character but somehow more alive, more welcoming than it had seemed during his years of isolation. Tiva emerged from the cabin and stretched luxuriously in the morning warmth. Her recovery had been so complete that she was actually stronger and more vibrant than she had been before the snake attack. The community's care during her healing had taught her to trust humans in ways that had deepened her bond with Gray Hawk. While expanding her capacity for connection with others, a dust cloud on the horizon announced the approach of the first visitors of the day. Probably Sarah Chen, bringing a new group of children for their weekly nature lesson. Gray Hawk picked up his teaching staff and felt the familiar surge of purpose that had replaced the hollow ache of grief that had dominated his life for so many years. The staff itself had become something of a legend in the region. Other communities had heard about the carved juniper pole that symbolized shared knowledge and mutual care, and several groups had commissioned similar ceremonial objects for their own teachers and leaders. But Gray Hawk knew that the real power wasn't in the staff itself. It was in the network of relationships it represented, the web of care and responsibility that connected him to dozens of people who had become more than neighbors. They were family, chosen and earned through shared experiences of helping each other through difficulties. As the approaching vehicle resolved into Sarah's familiar school bus, Gray Hawk smiled at the continuity of it all. The same desert dawn that had witnessed his grandfather's morning prayers now illuminated his own daily ritual of service to others. The same landscape that had sheltered his ancestors for centuries was now teaching new generations of children to find their place. In the natural world, Tiva's tail wagged as she recognized the sound of young voices growing closer. Gray Hawk shouldered his medical pack, picked up his teaching staff, and walked toward the fire pit to begin another day of sharing the gifts that isolation had nearly convinced him to keep buried forever. The desert dawn held the same promise. It always had. Another day to make a difference, another chance to transform knowledge into wisdom, another opportunity to prove that love, even when it requires courage, is always worth the risk.